Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Emma by Jane Austen. When last we left Highbury, Emma was disappointed. Her new-found friend and confidant, Mr. Frank Churchill, has had to leave the district on very short notice, which has foiled her plans for a wonderful dance in which he will be the principal character. It is a shame, and I think it is one of the first times where Emma herself has felt truly disappointed. I will be interested to see what comes next. So let's dive right in with chapter 31. Emma continued to entertain no doubt of her being in love. Her ideas only varied as to the how much. At first, she thought it was a good deal, and afterwards, but little. She had great pleasure in hearing Frank Churchill talked of, and, for his sake, greater pleasure than ever in seeing Mr. and Mrs. Weston. She was very often thinking of him, and quite impatient for a letter, that she might know how he was, how were his spirits, how was his aunt, and what was the chance of his coming to Randalls again this spring. But, on the other hand, she could not admit herself to be unhappy, nor, after the first morning, to be less disposed for employment than usual. She was still busy and cheerful, and, pleasing as he was, she could yet imagine him to have faults, and father, though thinking of him so much, and as she sat drawing or working, forming 1,000 amusing schemes for the progress and close of their attachment, fancying interesting dialogues, and inventing elegant letters, the conclusion of every imaginary declaration on his side was that she refused him. Their affection was always to subside into friendship. Everything tender and charming was to mark their parting, but still they were to part. When she became sensible to this, it struck her that she could not be very much in love, for in spite of her previous and fixed determination never to quit her father, never to marry, a strong attachment, certainly, must produce more of a struggle than she could foresee in her own feelings. I do not find myself making any use of the word sacrifice, said she. In not one of all my clever replies, my delicate negatives, is there any allusion to making a sacrifice. I do suspect that he is not really necessary to my happiness, so much the better. I certainly will not persuade myself to feel more than I do. I am quite enough in love. I should be sorry to be more. Upon the whole, she was equally contented with her view of his feelings, He is undoubtedly very much in love. Everything denotes it. Very much in love indeed. And when he comes again, if his affection continue, I must be on my guard not to encourage it. It would be most inexcusable to do otherwise, as my own mind is quite made up. Not that I imagine he can think I have been encouraging him hitherto. No, if he had believed me at all to share his feelings, he would not have been so wretched. Could he have thought himself encouraged, his looks and language at parting would have been different. Still, however, I must be on my guard. This is in the supposition of his attachment continuing what it now is, but I do not know that I expect it will. I do not look upon him to be quite the sort of man. I do not, altogether, build upon his steadiness or constancy. His feelings are warm, but I can imagine them rather changeable. Every consideration of the subject, in short, makes me thankful that my happiness is not more deeply involved. I shall do very well again after a little while, and then it will be a good thing over, for they say everybody is in love once in their lives, and I shall have been let off easily. When his letter arrived to Mrs. Weston, Emma had the perusal of it, and she read it with a degree of pleasure and admiration which made her at first shake her head over her own sensations, and think she had undervalued their strength. It was a long, well-written letter, giving the particulars of his journey and his feelings, expressing all the affection, gratitude, and respect which was natural and honourable, and describing everything exterior and local that could be supposed attractive, with spirit and precision. No suspicious flourishes now of apology or concern. It was the language of real feeling towards Mrs. Weston, and the transition from Highbury to Enscombe, the contrast between the places in some of the first blessings of social life, was just enough touched on to show how keenly it was felt, and how much more might have been said but for the restraints of propriety. The charm of her own name was not wanting. Miss Woodhouse appeared more than once, and never without a something of pleasing connection, either a compliment to her taste or a remembrance of what she had said, and in the very last time of its meeting her eye, unadorned as it was by any such broad wreath of gallantry, she could yet discern the effect of her influence, and acknowledge the greatest compliment perhaps of all conveyed. Compressed into the very lowest vacant corner were these words: "I had not a spare moment on Tuesday, as you know, for Miss Woodhouse's beautiful little friend. Pray make my excuses and adieus to her." This, Emma could not doubt, was all for herself. Harriet was remembered only from being her friend. His information and prospects as to Enscombe were neither worse nor better than had been anticipated. Mrs. Churchill was recovering, and he dared not yet, even in his own imagination, fix a time for coming to Randalls again. Gratifying, however, and stimulative as was the letter in the material part, its sentiments, she yet found, when it was folded up and returned to Mrs. Weston, that it had not added any lasting warmth, that she could still do without the writer, and that he must learn to do without her. Her intentions were unchanged. Her resolution of refusal only grew more interesting by the addition of a scheme for his subsequent consolation and happiness. His recollection of Harriet, and the words which clothed it, the beautiful little friend, suggested to her the idea of Harriet's succeeding her in his affections. Was it impossible? No. Harriet undoubtedly was greatly his inferior in understanding, but he had been very much struck with the loveliness of her face and the warm simplicity of her manner, and all the probabilities of circumstance and connection were in her favour. For Harriet, it would be advantageous and delightful indeed. "I must not dwell upon it," said she. "I must not think of it. I know the danger of indulging such speculations, but stranger things have happened. And when we cease to care for each other as we do now, it will be the means of confirming us in that sort of true, disinterested friendship which I can already look forward to with pleasure." It was well to have a comfort in store on Harriet's behalf, though it might be wise to let the fancy touch it seldom, for evil in that quarter was at hand. As Frank Churchill's arrival had succeeded Mr. Elton's engagement in the conversation of Highbury, as the latest interest had been entirely borne down the first, so now, upon Frank Churchill's disappearance, Mr. Elton's concerns were assuming the most irresistible form. His wedding day was named. He would soon be among them again, Mr. Elton and his bride. There was hardly time to talk over the first letter from Enscombe before Mr. Elton and his bride was in everybody's mouth, and Frank Churchill was forgotten. Emma grew sick of the sound. She had had 3 weeks of happy exemption from Mr. Elton, and Harriet's mind, she had been willing to hope, had been lately gaining strength. With Mr. Weston's ball in view, at least, there had been a great deal of insensibility to other things, but it was now too evident that she had not attained such a state of composure as could stand against the actual approach. New carriage, bell ringing, and all. Poor Harriet was in a flutter of spirits which required all the reasonings and soothings and attentions of every kind that Emma could give. Emma felt that she could not do too much for her, that Harriet had a right to all her ingenuity and her patience, but it was heavy work to be forever convincing without producing any effect, forever agreed to without being able to make their opinions the same. Harriet listened submissively and said, "It was very true. It was just as Miss Woodhouse described. It was not worth while to think about them, and she would not think about them any longer." But no change of subject could avail, and the next half hour saw her as anxious and restless about the Eltons as before. At last, Emma attacked her on another ground. "Your allowing yourself to be so occupied and so unhappy about Mr. Elton's marrying, Harriet, is the strongest reproach you can make me. You could not give me a greater reproof for the mistake I fell into. It was all my doing, I know. I have not forgotten it, I assure you. Deceived myself, I did very miserably deceive you, and it will be a painful reflection to me forever. Do not imagine me in danger of forgetting it." Harriet felt this too much to utter more than a few words of eager exclamation. Emma continued, I have not said, exert yourself, Harriet, for my sake. Think less, talk less of Mr. Elton for my sake. Because for your sake, rather, I should wish it to be done, for the sake of what is more important than my comfort, a habit of self-command in you, a consideration of what is your duty, an attention to propriety, an endeavour to avoid the suspicions of others, to save your health and credit, to restore your tranquillity. These are the motives which I have been pressing on you. They are very important, and sorry I am that you cannot feel them sufficiently to act upon them. My being saved from pain is a very secondary consideration. I want you to save yourself from greater pain. Perhaps I may sometimes have felt that Harriet would not forget what was due, or rather, what would be kind by me. This appeal to her affections did more than all the rest. The idea of wanting gratitude and consideration for Miss Woodhouse, whom she really loved extremely, made her wretched for a while, and when the violence of grief was comforted away, still remained powerful enough to prompt to what was right and support her in it very tolerably. You, who have been the best friend I ever had in my life, want gratitude to you? Oh, nobody is equal to you. I care for nobody as I do for you. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, how ungrateful I have been. Such expressions, assisted as they were by everything that look and manner could do, made Emma feel that she had never loved Harriet so well, nor valued her affection so highly before. There is no charm equal to tenderness of heart, she said afterwards to herself. There is nothing to be compared to it. Warmth and tenderness of heart, with an affectionate, open manner, will beat all the clearness of head in the world for attraction. I am sure it will. It is tenderness of heart which makes my dear father so generally beloved, which gives Isabella all her popularity. I have it not, but I know how to prize and respect it. Harriet is my superior in all the charm and all the felicity it gives. Dear Harriet, I would not change you for the clearest-headed, longest-sighted, best-judging female breathing. Oh, the coldness of a Jane Fairfax! Harriet is worth 100 such, and for a wife, a sensible man's wife, it is invaluable. I mention no names, but happy the man who changes Emma for Harriet. Chapter 32. Mr. Elton was first seen at church, but though devotion might be interrupted, curiosity could not be satisfied by a bride in a pew, and it must be left for the visits in form which were then to be paid, to settle whether she were very pretty indeed, or only rather pretty, or not pretty at all. Emma had feelings, less of curiosity than of pride or propriety, to make her resolve on not being the last to pay her respects, and she made a point of Harriet's going with her, that the worst of the business might be gone through as soon as possible. She could not enter the house again, could not be in the same room to which she had with such vain artifice retreated 3 months ago, to lace up her boot, without recollecting. 1,000 vexations and thoughts would recur, compliments, charades, and horrible blunders, and it was not to be supposed that poor Harriet should not be recollecting too, but she behaved very well, and was only rather pale and silent. The visit was of course short, and there was so much embarrassment and occupation of mind to shorten it that Emma would not allow herself entirely to form an opinion of the lady, and on no account to give one, beyond the nothing-meaning terms of being elegantly dressed and very pleasing. She did not really like her. She would not be in a hurry to find fault, but she suspected that there was no elegance. Ease, but not elegance. She was almost sure that for a young woman, a stranger, a bride, there was too much ease. Her person was rather good, her face not unpretty, but neither feature, nor air, nor voice, nor manner were elegant. Emma thought, at least, it would turn out so. As for Mr. Elton, his manners did not appear. But no, she would not permit a hasty or a witty word from herself about his manners. It was an awkward ceremony at any time to be receiving wedding visits, and a man had need to be all grace to acquit himself well through it. The woman was better off. She might have the assistance of fine clothes and the privilege of bashfulness, but the man had only his own good sense to depend on, and when she considered how peculiarly unlucky poor Mr. Elton was in being in the same room at once with the woman he had just married, the woman he had wanted to marry, and the woman whom he had been expected to marry, she must allow him to have the right to look as little wise and to be as much affectedly and as little really easy as could be. "Well, Miss Woodhouse," said Harriet, when they had quitted the house, and after waiting in vain for her friend to begin. "Well, Miss Woodhouse," with a gentle sigh, "what do you think of her? Is not she very charming?" There was a little hesitation in Emma's answer. "Oh, yes, very. A very pleasing young woman. I think her beautiful, quite beautiful. Very nicely dressed indeed. A remarkably elegant gown. I am not at all surprised that he should have fallen in love." "Oh, no, there is nothing to surprise one at all. A pretty fortune, and she came in his way." "I dare say," returned Harriet, sighing again, "I dare say she was very much attached to him." "Perhaps she might, but it is not every man's fate to marry the woman who loves him best. Miss Hawkins perhaps wanted a home, and thought this the best offer she was likely to have." "Yes," said Harriet earnestly, "and well she might. Nobody could ever have a better. Well, I wish them happy with all my heart. And now, Miss Woodhouse, I do not think I shall mind seeing them again. He is just as superior as ever, but being married, you know, it is quite a different thing. No, indeed, Miss Woodhouse, you need not be afraid. I can sit and admire him now without any great misery. To know that he has not thrown himself away is such a comfort. She does seem a charming young woman, just what he deserves. Happy creature. He called her Augusta. How delightful." When the visit was returned, Emma made up her mind. She could then see more and judge better. From Harriet's happening not to be at Hartfield, and her father's being present to engage Mr. Elton, she had a quarter of an hour of the lady's conversation to herself, and could composedly attend to her. And the quarter of an hour quite convinced her that Mrs. Elton was a vain woman, extremely well satisfied with herself, and thinking much of her own importance, that she meant to shine and be very superior, but with manners which had been formed in a bad school, pert and familiar, that all her notions were drawn from one set of people and one style of living, that if not foolish, she was ignorant, and that her society would certainly do Mr. Elton no good. Harriet would have been a much better match. If not wise or refined herself, she would have connected him with those who were, but Miss Hawkins, it might be fairly supposed from her easy conceit, had been the best of her own set. The rich brother-in-law near Bristol was the pride of the alliance, and his place and his carriages were the pride of him. The first subject, after being seated, was Maple Grove, my brother, Mr. Suckling's seat. A comparison of Hartfield to Maple Grove. The grounds of Hartfield were small, but neat and pretty, and the house was modern and well built. Mrs. Elton seemed most favourably impressed by the size of the room, the entrance, and all that she could see or imagine. Very like Maple Grove indeed. She was quite struck by the likeness. That room was the very shape and size of the morning room at Maple Grove, her sister's favourite room. Mr. Elton was appealed to. Was it not astonishingly like? She could really almost fancy herself at Maple Grove. And the staircase. You know, as I came in, I observed how very like the staircase was, placed exactly in the same part of the house. I really could not help examining. I assure you, Miss Woodhouse, it's very delightful to me to be reminded of a place I am so extremely partial to as Maple Grove. I have spent many happy months there. A charming place, undoubtedly. Everybody who sees it is struck by its beauty. But to me it has been quite a home. Whenever you are transplanted like me, Miss Woodhouse, you will understand how very delightful it is to meet with anything at all like what one has left behind. I always say this is quite one of the evils of matrimony. Emma made as slight a reply as she could, but it was fully sufficient for Mrs. Elton, who only wanted to be talking herself. So extremely like Maple Grove, and is it not merely the house? The grounds, I assure you, as far as I could observe, are strikingly alike. The laurels at Maple Grove are in the same profusion as here, and stand very much in the same way, just across the lawn. And I had a glimpse of a fine large tree with a bench round it, which put me so exactly in mind. My brother and sister will be enchanted with this place. People who have extensive grounds themselves are always pleased with anything in the same style. Emma doubted the truth of this sentiment. She had a great idea that people who had extensive grounds themselves cared very little for the extensive grounds of anybody else. But it was not worth while to attack an error so double-dyed, and therefore only said in reply, "When you have seen more of this country, I am afraid you will think you have overrated Hartfield. Surrey is full of beauties." "Oh, yes, I'm quite aware of that. It is the Garden of England, you know. Surrey is the Garden of England." "Yes, but we must not rest our claims on that distinction. Many counties, I believe, are called the Garden of England, as well as Surrey." "No, I fancy not," replied Mrs. Elton, with a most satisfied smile. "I never heard any county but Surrey called so." Emma was silenced. "My brother and sister have promised us a visit in the spring or summer at farthest," continued Mrs. Elton, "and that will be our time for exploring. While they are with us, we shall explore a great deal, I dare say. They have their barouche landau, of course, which holds four perfectly, and therefore, without saying anything of our carriage, we should be able to explore the different beauties extremely well. They would hardly come in their chaise, I think, at that season of the year. Indeed, when the time draws on, I shall be decidedly recommending their bringing the barouche landau. It will be so very much preferable. When people come into a beautiful country of this sort, you know, Miss Woodhouse, one naturally wishes them to see as much as possible, and Mr. Suckling is extremely fond of exploring. We explored to King's Weston twice last summer in that way, most delightfully, just after their first having the barouche landau. You have many parties of that kind here, I suppose, Miss Woodhouse, every summer? No, not immediately here. We are rather out of distance of the very striking beauties which attract the sort of parties you speak of, and we are a very quiet set of people, I believe, more disposed to stay at home than engage in schemes of pleasure. Ah, there's nothing like staying at home for real comfort. Nobody can be more devoted to home than I am. I was quite a proverb for it at Maple Grove. Many a time has Selina said when she has been going to Bristol, I really cannot get this girl to move from the house. I absolutely must go in by myself, though I hate being stuck up in the barouche landau without a companion. But Augusta, I believe, with her own goodwill, would never stir beyond the park paling. Many a time has she said so, and yet I am no advocate for entire seclusion. I think, on the contrary, when people shut themselves up entirely from society, it's a very bad thing, and that it is much more advisable to mix in the world in a proper degree, without living in it either too much or too little. I perfectly understand your situation, however, Miss Woodhouse. Looking towards Mr. Woodhouse, your father's state of health must be a great drawback. Why does not he try Bath? Indeed he should. Let me recommend Bath to you. I assure you I have no doubt of its doing Mr. Woodhouse good. My father tried it more than once, formerly, but without receiving any benefit, and Mr. Perry, whose name I dare say is not unknown to you, does not conceive it would be at all more likely to be useful now. Oh, that's a great pity, for I assure you, Miss Woodhouse, where the waters do agree, it is quite wonderful the relief they give. In my Bath life I have seen such instances of it, and it is so cheerful a place that it could not fail of being of use to Mr. Woodhouse's spirits, which I understand are sometimes much depressed. And as to its recommendations to you, I fancy I need not take much pains to dwell on them. The advantages of Bath to the young are pretty generally understood. It would be a charming introduction for you who have lived so secluded a life, and I could immediately secure you some of the best society in the place. A line from me would bring you a little host of acquaintance, and my particular friend, Mrs. Partridge, the lady I have always resided with when in Bath, would be most happy to show you any attentions, and would be the very person for you to go into public with. It was as much as Emma could bear, without being impolite. The idea of her being indebted to Mrs. Elton for what was called an introduction, of her going into public under the auspices of a friend of Mrs. Elton's, probably some vulgar, dashing widow who, with the help of a boarder, just made a shift to live. The dignity of Miss Woodhouse, of Hartfield, was sunk indeed. She restrained herself, however, from any of the reproofs she could have given, and only thanked Mrs. Elton coolly. But their going to Bath was quite out of the question, and she was not perfectly convinced that the place might suit her better than her father. And then, to prevent further outrage and indignation, she changed the subject directly. "I do not ask whether you are musical, Mrs. Elton. Upon these occasions a lady's character generally precedes her, and Highbury has long known that you are a superior performer." "Oh, no, indeed, I must protest against any such idea. A superior performer? Far from it, I assure you. Consider from how partial the quarter your information came. I am dotingly fond of music, passionately fond, and my friend says I am not entirely devoid of taste. But as to anything else, upon my honour, my performance is mediocre to the last degree. You, Miss Woodhouse, I know, play delightfully. I assure you it has been a great satisfaction, comfort, and delight to me to hear what a musical society I am going into. I absolutely cannot do without music. It is a necessity of life to me, and having always been used to a very musical society both at Maple Grove and in Bath, it would have been a most serious sacrifice. I honestly said as much to Mr. E. when he was speaking of my future home, and expressing his fears lest the retirement of it should be disagreeable, and the inferiority of the house, too, knowing what I had been accustomed to. Of course, he was not wholly without apprehension. When he was speaking of it in that way, I honestly said that the world I could give up. Parties, balls, plays, for I had no fear of retirement. Blessed with so many resources within myself, the world was not necessary to me. I could do very well without it. To those who had no resources, it was a different thing. But my resources made me quite independent. And as to smaller-sized rooms than I had been used to, I really could not give it a thought. I hoped I was perfectly equal to any sacrifice in that description. Certainly I had been accustomed to every luxury at Maple Grove, but I did reassure him that 2 carriages were not necessary to my happiness, nor were spacious apartments. "But," said I, "to be quite honest, I do not think I can live without something of a musical society. I condition for nothing else, but without music, life would be a blank to me." "We cannot suppose," said Emma, smiling, "that Mr. Elton would hesitate to assure you of there being a very musical society in Highbury, and I hope you will not find he has outstepped the truth more than may be pardoned in consideration of the motive." "No, indeed, I have no doubts at all on that head. I am delighted to find myself in such a circle. I hope we shall have many sweet little concerts together. I think, Miss Woodhouse, you and I must establish a musical club, and have regular weekly meetings at your house or ours. Will it not be a good plan? If we exert ourselves, I think we shall not be long in want of allies. Something of that nature would be particularly desirable for me, as an inducement to keep me in practice. For married women, you know, there is a sad story against them in general. They are but too apt to give up music." "But you, who are so supremely fond of it, there can be no danger, surely?" "I should hope not. But really, when I look round among my acquaintance, I tremble. Selina has entirely given up music, never touches the instrument, though she played sweetly. And the same may be said of Mrs. Jeffreys, Clara Partridge that was, and of the 2 Millmans, now Mrs. Bird and Mrs. James Cooper, and of more than I can enumerate. Upon my word, it is enough to put one in A fright. I used to be quite angry with Selina, but really I begin now to comprehend that a married woman has many things to call her attention. I believe I was half an hour this morning shut up with my housekeeper. But everything of that kind, said Emma, will soon be in so regular a train. Well, said Mrs. Elton, laughing, we shall see. Emma, finding her so determined upon neglecting her music, had nothing more to say, and after a moment's pause, Mrs. Elton chose another subject. We have been calling at Randall's, said she, and found them both at home, and a very pleasant couple they seem to be. I like them extremely. Mr. Weston seems an excellent creature, quite a first-rate favourite with me already, I assure you, and she appears so truly good. There is something so motherly and kind-hearted about her that it wins upon one directly. Oh, she was your governess, I think. Emma was almost too much astonished to answer, but Mrs. Elton hardly waited for the affirmative before she went on. Having understood as much, I was rather astonished to find her so very ladylike, but she really is quite the gentlewoman. Mrs. Weston's manners, said Emma, were always particularly good. Their propriety, simplicity, and elegance would make them the safest model for any young woman. And who do you think came in while we were there? Emma was quite at a loss. The tone implied some old acquaintance, but how could she possibly guess? Knightley, continued Mrs. Elton. Knightley himself, was it not so lucky? For not being with him when he called the other day, I had never seen him before, and of course, as so particular a friend of Mr. E.'s, I had a great curiosity. My friend Knightley had been so often mentioned that I was really impatient to see him, and I must do my caro sposo the justice to say that he need not be ashamed of his friend. Knightley is quite the gentleman. I like him very much. Decidedly, I think, a very gentleman-like gentleman. Happily, it was now time to be off. They were gone, and Emma could breathe. Insufferable woman, was her immediate exclamation. Worse than I had supposed. Absolutely insufferable. Knightley. I could not have believed it. Knightley. Never seen him in her life before, and called him Knightley. And discover that he is a gentleman, a little upstart, vulgar being with her Mr. E., and her caro sposo, and her resources, and all her airs of pert pretension and underbred finery, actually to discover that Mr. Knightley is a gentleman. I doubt whether he will return the compliment and discover her to be a lady. I could not have believed it. And to propose that she and I should unite to form a musical club. One would fancy we were bosom friends. And Mrs. Weston, astonished that the person who had brought me up should be a gentlewoman. Worse and worse. I never met with her equal, much beyond my hopes. Harriet is disgraced by any comparison. Oh, what would Frank Churchill say to her if he were here? How angry and diverted he would be. Oh, there I am, thinking of him directly. Always the first person to be thought of. How I catch myself out. Frank Churchill comes as regularly into my mind. All this ran so glibly through her thoughts that by the time her father had arranged himself, after the bustle of the Eltons' departure, and was ready to speak, she was very tolerably capable of attending. Well, my dear, he deliberately began, considering we never saw her before, she seems a very pretty sort of young lady, and I dare say she was very much pleased with you. She speaks a little too quick. A little quickness of voice there is, which rather hurts the ear. But I believe I am nice. I do not like strange voices, and nobody speaks like you and poor Miss Taylor. However, she seems a very obliging, pretty-behaved young lady, and no doubt will make him a very good wife, though I think he had better not have married. I made the best excuses I could for not having been able to wait on him and Mrs. Elton on this happy occasion. I said that I hoped I should in the course of the summer, but I ought to have gone before. Not to wait upon a bride is very remiss. It shows what a sad invalid I am. But I do not like the corner into Vicarage Lane. I dare say your apologies were accepted, sir. Mr. Elton knows you. Yes, but a young lady, a bride. I ought to have paid my respects to her, if possible. It was being very deficient. But, my dear papa, you are no friend to matrimony, and therefore why should you be so anxious to pay your respects to a bride? It ought not be no recommendation to you. It is encouraging people to marry, if you make so much of them. No, my dear, I never encouraged anybody to marry, but I would always wish to pay every proper attention to a lady, and a bride, especially, is never to be neglected. More is avowedly due to her. A bride, you know, my dear, is always the first in company, let the others be who they may. Well, papa, if this is not encouragement to marry, I do not know what is, and I should never have expected you to be lending your sanction to such vanity baits for poor young ladies. My dear, you do not understand me. This is a matter of mere common politeness and good breeding, and has nothing to do with any encouragement to people to marry. Emma had done. Her father was growing nervous, and could not understand her. Her mind returned to Mrs. Elton's offences, and long, very long, did they occupy her. All right, we will leave it there for now. I am fascinated that Emma came out and said, at the very start of chapter 31, that she felt herself in love with Frank Churchill. It is something that has been in the subtext for the last couple of chapters, as I'm sure you noticed, but I was not expecting to see it writ so large upon Emma's mind, and somehow I do not think it is going to be so easy for her to forget him. I'm intrigued by Mrs. Elton, though. I look forward to seeing what new spanner she throws into the works of Emma's well-oiled life in Highbury. I look forward to finding out next time on Soft Stories. Until then, from myself and from Pepper, I must bid you a fond farewell. I wish you all the best, and goodbye.